Thank you very much, everyone. Now, we now have our second fireside chat of the day, and this is with Patricia Sellers. Patricia is the Special Advisor on Slavery Crimes for the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, and she's come in all the way from Brussels to join us today. So please do give her a warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sultana. I'm quite honored to be here. And I am absolutely enthralled by the energy in this room. It is so rare that I walk into a conference of lawyers and feel this energetic vibe that's just kind of levitating from you. And so I hope that today in our fireside chat, I don't see the fire.
Over here, in here.
Out there,
out there, in
Okay.
each of us.
That we can be informal and formal enough to get to some very important issues coming from myself, from Sultana, but most importantly, coming from you in your careers.
Thank you so much. I feel like we've reversed roles now a little bit. I'm just going to tell you very briefly about Patty, and I hope she will elaborate a lot more about the kinds of things she's done. If I were to go through her CV, we would be here all day. The work she has done is outstanding. She is, as I said, an advisor on slavery crimes. Prior to that, she was the special advisor to the prosecutor of the ICC on gender. She's a visiting fellow at Kellogg College at the University of Oxford, where she teaches international criminal law and human rights law. Patty was also my my dissertation supervisor at Oxford. She's been widely consulted on international criminal law and humanitarian law matters. She's been a special legal consultant to UN Women, to the Gender and Women's Rights Division of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and to the UN Secretary General Special Representative to Children in Armed Conflict. In 2012, she was a member of an expert panel to review the UN Office of Internal Oversight that has initial jurisdiction over UN peacekeepers. She, as I said, she was the legal advisor for gender, the acting head of the legal advisory section, and a prosecutor at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia from 1994 to 2007. She was also involved in the ICTR, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and she developed legal strategies and was a member of the trial teams working on Akayesu, Furundi, Zija, and Kunyara cases. These landmark decisions remain the preeminent legal standard for the interpretation of sexual violence as war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, torture, and enslavement. So thank you so much, Patricia, I'll call you Patty.
Please.
Patricia, it sounded, I'm so used to calling you Patty. Thank you so much for being here. We are absolutely honored that you have made time for us and have come all the way from Brussels. And Patty is my personal hero in the field of law. So thank you so much. Now, I will ask you a question. So can you share some insights into your experience as a prosecutor at the ICTY and the ICTR, particularly around legal strategies and landmark decisions on cases involving sexual violence as war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide?
Right. Thank you very much, Sultana. Let me tell you one of my experiences, which I thought was unusual but became a norm in international criminal law, and particularly in terms of sexual violence and women's rights, is that you have to fight. I was surrounded by international lawyers of high esteem. Most of them were very tall, white men with gray hair. In other words, intimidating. That's what the international lawyer was supposed to look like. And so at the Rwanda tribunal, when I proposed that the sexual violence that had occurred almost against every Tutsi woman before she was killed was as much part of the genocide as her killing, and that we couldn't just focus on the killing mainly of men and a couple killing of women and completely ignore an act that had occurred of sexual violence in such a regular cadence during the genocide. I had to fight for this, and I was ostracized by most of the lawyers in the office. There were a couple brave lawyers who stood next to me, in particularly women and some men. And finally, we were able, with civil society advocacy and my own advocacy, to include sexual violence within the count of genocide. And once it was included, and once the judges looked at the evidence, it was not only undeniable, it was way beyond a reasonable doubt that the intent to commit genocide included the intent to cause serious bodily mental harm to members of the group who were women via sexual violence. Now that is just a standard. One would never think of examining genocide without necessarily seeing if there was sexual violence against men or women. But when that standard went through, myself and a few other lawyers, we had to stand strong. The other side of it is now that it is a standard, all of the lawyers who are against me are trying to think it was their idea. I don't mind. I think there's some grace in allowing them to now join the party. And the same thing occurred at the Yugoslav tribunal. When the case of Kunarac came up, there was a situation where several different girls and women, and I want to emphasize girls of 12 years old, 14-year-old, 15-year-olds, women who are in their 20s, were taken to a series of different houses by a militia group to be sexually assaulted and finally to be sold. Now, while there was a lot of outcry, even from the feminist movement, that these are rapes that we have to charge as torture, I and one or two other colleagues decided there's something even beyond that that's occurring, that these females are enslaved. And we brought forward charges of enslavement under crimes against humanity. They were made to dance on desktops or tabletops naked. They were made to have sexual access to up to 50 men a week, and they were made to wash dishes. And we had some colleagues who said, so what's enslavement? Forced dishwashing? Ha, ha, ha. Well, the answer to that is yes, part of the enslavement was the forced domestic labor. But today that is a standard under international criminal law, that enslavement is part of crimes against humanity, and that there are many ways that someone can exercise powers of ownership over you, or in other words, being enslaved. So what I took from the Yugoslav Rwanda tribunal, it was a wonderful ability to be on the cutting edge of international criminal law. Every day was a de novo situation legally, but you still had to stand your ground. And it didn't mean you were going to be the most popular person in the cafeteria, but it did mean that you could look yourself in the mirror and slowly you saw that the team and the community came toward you, even if it took years.
Thank you, Patty. Why do you think there was this kind of pushback? Why was there a reluctance to recognize this for what it is? Why did you have to push so hard, and why did you have to fight so hard? And we're glad that you did, but why was that, and how have things changed now?
Why was there that reluctance? I think a couple of your speakers have really specifically targeted why it was there. It's patriarchy in the international criminal law system, that we think the most important thing that occurs, even in atrocity situations of genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes, is what happens to men, or maybe what happens to boys. And so to say what happened to these women prior to their killing in a genocide, that seemed like a step too far. Patriarchy was reinforcing itself. You know, genocide doesn't happen until we reach a certain number of male bodies who are dead. But we know that you can have a genocide and not one dead body or male body, and have non-killing acts, the transfer of children to different groups. So it was fighting against the patriarchy that had been caught in the international criminal law. And enslavement under crimes against humanity was just this notion of, well, haven't we given you enough by letting you charge rape, Patty? Is she coming back with another charge, torture? My God, enslavement. Well, it's not as if you weren't doing Patty a favor. It was about the survivors and about the victims who didn't survive. And that's who we were there to serve. But patriarchy will reinforce itself every chance it gets unless you target those discriminatory places within the law.
Thank you. And so how would you, so now you said now it's the norm, it's recognized. What has changed then? So of course your work was just instrumental in bringing about change. How has that remained, or how has that now developed into being the norm?
Well, that's the norm in the sense of that crimes against humanity are certainly seen to include forms of sexual violence, and that sexual violence can be included in enslavement. Matter of fact, at the International Criminal Court, you have sexual slavery as a provision. As I stated before, when we look at genocide in any situation now, it is not unusual. As a matter of fact, if you didn't look for sexual violence or some form of gender-based violence within a genocide, you should consider yourself incompetent, and you should be considered by your colleagues as being incompetent in terms of your investigation or in your prosecution. But what I want to say is that we still have those places within international criminal law that are reflected in the national law and then back up to international criminal law, where we do see that girls are not as protected. I think Sarita, a colleague from a long time, has spoken quite eloquently about it. Right now, we're looking at the following issues in international criminal law. One is the question of forced marriage. Up until now, forced marriage is seen as part of an other inhumane act under crimes against humanity. But there are feminist advocates right now trying to make sure in the new Crimes Against Humanity Treaty that that is a separate provision, that that is a provision of a crime against humanity. Myself, I'm advocating for an inclusion of the slave trade within the new Crimes Against Humanity, because all of the instances of enslavement and sexual slavery are preceded by someone being slave traded. And then after you are either enslaved or sexually enslaved, and then you are given to a new owner, I even hate to use this terminology, that's another incidence of slave trading. And slave trading can be very gendered. Girls in Boko Haram do not want their breasts to grow, because they know as soon as they go into puberty and their breast grows, they are going to be enslaved and slave traded. The other girls in Uganda knew that their menstrual cycles were checked. And as soon as they menstruated, they knew that they would become forced brides, they would be slave traded. So these are the new areas that we're still working on, where there's pushback from the patriarchy in terms of, do we really need this law? Can't we just use something we have already, or why don't we call it something else? So you stand up and say, no, but I know this game. I've been there, been at that party, know the ending. I put on the music now.
Thank you, Patty. So actually, can you then tell us a little bit more, or a lot more, about the work that you're doing at the ICC as the Special Advisor on Gender, and how are you involved in drafting the new treaty? Are you developing policies internally?
Mm-hmm.
You were the advisor on gender, so what's the difference between the two? Is there just more of a focus on slavery now, as opposed to other aspects of gender? Or please do tell us a little bit more about
Right.
what you're involved in.
Well, between 2015 and 2020, I was a special advisor for gender at the International Criminal Court. And whether you can believe it or not, but it wasn't until 2016 that the International Criminal Court had the first conviction for sexual violence after having been functioning for almost 20 years. Well, why is that? It's often because, oh, we forgot to put the sexual violence evidence in the case, we forgot to send the investigator out, or it was pleaded incorrectly. And so during my tenure of gender advisor and speaking to teams, giving training sessions, seminars, and then working with the evidence and sometimes the witness, is that you have to have the correct evidence in at the correct time with the correct legal characterization, so that the judge believes, A, that you believe in your case, that you've proven it beyond a reasonable doubt. In the past 3 to 4 years, through many actions, not just mine, but through dedicated lawyers, through dedicated investigators analysts, we've been able to come forward to the International Criminal Court with convictions based upon sexual violence in the Ntaganda case. And this is a case that in some ways has gone under the radar screen. There's been a lot of focus on the fact that these are child soldiers, which is absolutely correct. But there's also focus that some of the girl child soldiers were also sexually enslaved. But the defense really brought up an innovative and possibly what could have been seen as a correct defense to say, under war crimes, you can't commit a war crime against your own side. You can only commit a war crime against the enemy's side. Or if it's in a civil war, you can only commit a war crime against someone who's no longer engaged in the war. But these girl soldiers, are not the opposite side, and they're still engaged in the war. And so the defense said, you can't charge any crimes that my accused has done against these girl soldiers, such as rape. And so that went back and forth between interlocutory appeals. And the appeals chamber and the trial chamber, for the first time, ruled that committing sexual violence against the girls on your own side, girl soldiers, was a war crime. And that was under the category of sexual slavery and rape. And then they went one step further. For me, it was the cherry on top. They said rape was a jus cogent violation, which is the highest violation of international law, which means it can never be ever conceded under any circumstances to be legal, and particularly within an armed conflict. And that has been a fight that has been going on for, I would say, over 60 years. I remember writing an article 25 years ago of what is the legal value of rape. And finally, there's been a pronouncement that you cannot rape in situations of emergency. There is no ever a legal reason to commit rape, even against your own side. So I think that are among the things that have changed. And there are several cases, including one that should come out within the next 2 or 3 weeks, that is looking at gender persecution. And gender persecution is seeing how women or girls are discriminated against, and then listing what is that human rights violation that has been omitted to be able to be extended to them. So these are the cutting edges of international criminal law for women. The other is, and Sarita did not talk about it, in the new draft Crimes Against Humanity Treaty, of which I'm involved with the Feminist Coalition, they're raising the possibility of having the crime of gender apartheid in relationship to possibly the acts that occur in Afghanistan. And that's the same time as I'm raising the issues of slave trade, others of forced marriage. But what it's really saying is that we women are going to enter in on the drafting and the discussion of this Crimes Against Humanity Treaty from the beginning. You will not call us after you've already done the work in the negotiations. We're going to frame those negotiations and frame the issues.
So what kind of role do you think women lawyers play in this sphere of international law then? Was it quite different if we look back 20, 30, 40 years ago? Are there more women entering this arena, and are they being more vocal? I know Sarita has an incredible network of women. We have Michelle Stagg-Kelsall, who's speaking tomorrow, and they run this incredible network for women who are in international law. Is it the coming together of women and women pushing this forward and more women entering this arena, or is there something else that's influencing this?
Well, I think there are two things. I think when you look at international law from a human rights point of view, international human rights law or international criminal law, and I'm unfamiliar with international trade law, I see that women now look at this as a potential area to exercise profession in, but also still, in, I would say, in limited ways. And let me just tell you some of those limited ways. I think that women want to speak to women who might have been raped and make them break the silence. It's become a horrible cliche, I think. And I think it extends to almost a type of women doing, in their mind, something that's akin to missionary work, as opposed to situating that person who is a member of the international community, a citizen, within the vast network of harms that have occurred to them. And so it's wanting to and needing to learn about all of the spheres of international human rights law or international criminal law and situate that person who you really want to talk to, but who you really have to connect to humanly within their crimes because they represent the international community in court. Any witness I put on the stand, it's not a witness because, oh, this is a survivor, we should be sensitive. This is the bravest person who is making sure that when international crimes occur, that they're testifying on behalf of the international community so that those crimes can be adjudicated. So I do see a changing of how women are entering in. I do question when women don't want to talk about command responsibility, when women do not want to understand the relationship between a financial investigation and genocide. I do question it when a woman only wants to do what in their mind seems to be the feel-good missionary, I can hold her hand if she cries work. That's just a sliver of the technical skills that I think are necessary. So there's been change with more women, but I'm seeing women being too grouped or supposedly grouped in one area. And let me just conclude on that little part by, there's a misconception. There's a misconception that sexual violence is the easy part of the law or that it's the too hard part of the law. And in between those spaces is impunity. So I would wish that if any of you who are going into international human rights law, international criminal law, that you learn the entire gamut, you play the entire scale, you master your instrument of law completely.
Thank you, Patricia. Now, I often get asked this question whenever I give talks, and it's, international law really hasn't succeeded? In terms of, as you said, prosecution, there's only been the odd prosecution in relation to sexual violence. What then is the point of then pursuing it? What is the point then? If it's possible to fit something into an easier category, why not? Why keep pushing for different categories? Why keep pushing to add things on? And why pursue international law at all? What is the purpose of international criminal law if it hasn't secured mass convictions for mass rapes and sexual assaults and slavery and slave trade and enslavement and everything that's gone on? Why pursue it? Why continue? What is the point?
Yes, I guess that's the kind of question we get on international law of armed conflict hasn't stopped war, right? Well, that wasn't its purpose. Its purpose was to make war supposedly more humane. If we do not have these safeguards, these safe rails, I think the situations will be more vicious. One of the huge responsibilities that every nation has in terms of obeying international law is that sliver of obeying international law as it pertains to crimes. That's why there could be cases last week at the International Court of Justice, where a state can say to another state, I think you're violating the Genocide Convention, or you're violating the right to self-determination. If we did not have this international law, I think that really we go back to a world of dictators that have no checks on them. Now, everyone knows here in London and where I live in Brussels that there are a lot of laws about where you can and can't park a car. Does that mean that all cars have been parked in the correct place today? I mean, none of our laws are ever obeyed to the extent they are, or else there would not be courts and prisons, et cetera. So I think that's an easy way out to say they don't function, therefore we don't need them. Where I can see a difference is that 50 years ago, or I guess it was 75 years ago, when there was the Tokyo and Nuremberg tribunals, it seemed as if that would be the one-off. Okay, we did international courts and tribunals, and then politics came in with the Cold War. But then around 1994, this ideal of going back to international courts and tribunals started again with Rwanda and Yugoslavia. And then the International Criminal Court came, then the Special Court for Sierra Leone, then the East Timor trials. And slowly we've been seeing that within our common populace, we now have language that allows us to understand that these international crimes are part of our rights. And you will never hear a government say now, well, I believe I can torture as much as I want. They might, but they know it's an international crime. So I think that we are slowly gaining, not so much the recognition, but the livability of our own human rights as expressed through protection against international crimes.
Thank you, Patty. Now, in terms of, so you mentioned, for example, some are seeking the inclusion of gender apartheid, and there's been a lot of conversation around this, and is specifically in relation to the Taliban and what's going on in Afghanistan. Now, to what extent would you say politics plays a role in all of this as to what is or isn't included? Of course, you know, the Taliban are not flavor of the month or flavor of the or the decade or the last few
Right.
decades. So in that sense, it's quite easy to have that discussion and have that inclusion. But what about other aspects? And you know, as you deal with slave trade, but there are other aspects or other situations which aren't necessarily recognized. I mean, to what extent does politics play a role in it? And perhaps if I can throw in intersectionality, you know, are some causes more worthier than others? Are some crimes worth pursuing more than others? And do, you know, people's backgrounds, the victims' backgrounds, do they play a role in all of this?
Right. Well, I think one can say as the starting basis, if you ask yourself, which part of your humanity do you not want protected? Which part are you willing to throw away and say, okay, you don't have to protect that part? I don't think any of you would throw away any of your humanity, even as you understand it. So in terms of the gender apartheid, should females be made to live under legal regimes that deny their ability to participate politically, culturally, educationally? Are we willing to throw that part away and say, look, as long as I'm fed every day, I'm really not into it? You have to ask yourself that personally. And then you have to say, well, should states be responsible? Should that be part of what a crime against humanity is? So that does bring up the issue of, well, isn't that politics? Well, let me tell you the little secret. Politics are always there. You never separate politics from law. I find it amusing that we can talk about patriarchy and not understand that patriarchy builds different political systems to reinforce discrimination. Politics are always there, but what are you going to do to make new politics be there? And politics are the culmination of different policies that become different programs and ways that nations move forward. Politics will not leave us, but you can change the politics that are enforced upon us. Do you think in Afghanistan, if women had the right to vote, that would change anything? If women owned all the property, if women owned all the universities, if all of the foreign diplomats from Afghanistan were women, if you had to go through the Women's Coalition before you can have any economic access to any riches in Afghanistan, would that change things? Yes, because you've changed the politics. So I think we're going to have to just, you know, they say in this, ride or die. You have to ride knowing politics are there. And what are you going to do about it? One of the things I'm doing that you've asked before at the Office of the Prosecutor is we're developing a politics on how we approach slavery crimes. We're starting to understand that the Rome Statute in itself is not necessarily a perfect document. It has a huge, long list of war crimes. There are more war crimes in the Rome Statute document than in any other international statute for a court. But it's missing two crimes if you look carefully. Under war crimes, it's missing slavery and the slave trade. So it means that when you have child soldiers that are in militia groups, and then they're assigned to different militia groups, that's never categorized as slave trading the children. or you can never have them come under slavery, only sexual slavery. So being involved in policy is a way of being involved in the politics of the office, which now the investigators will eventually have to follow, and that'll be how the submissions of the prosecutor goes forward. And if I could just make a tiny pitch right here.
Yes, yes, please.
Okay, I'm in the middle of consultations of forming groups to consult with. What do you think is important or not that should be included in a slavery crimes policy? And I'd like to reach back out to you, Sultana, and to you women to be part of that consultancy. There'll be an open call for submissions. And so think to yourself, what should slavery crimes protect us from? And then please write me at the Office of the Prosecutor on that.
Thanks, Patty. I think we'll put together some submissions
Wonderful.
as part of the Girls Human Rights Hub. Thank you so much. Now, you've been extensively involved with the United Nations, including as a special legal consultant to the Secretary General's Special Representative to Children and to UN Women and to the Gender and Women Rights Division of the UNHCR. How have these experiences shaped your perspective on gender equality and women's rights on a global scale?
Well, how many of you are disappointed with the United Nations today? Should we throw it away completely? Go on, yeah. And the word reform sounds less than being revolutionary to respect human rights. And so that's how I feel about the United Nations. There are days when I'm shaking my head. There are other days when you go back in and you say, I can accomplish something here. And then there are other days when you say it's just too much of a bureaucracy. And it's too much of moving one pencil 1 inch over and claiming victory. And then when I talk to many civil servants from the United Nations, their first thing is either one of two conversations. Oh, I'm out in the field, but I'm really not doing anything because I'm putting on Band-Aids. And every time I solve one issue, here comes 10 more. I need to be up at headquarters, New York or Geneva, and really make long-standing, decisions and policies. But every time I go to Geneva or New York, they say, look, I'm sitting at a desk. Yes, I'm pushing a policy, but I'm really not doing anything. I need to get out in the field and be with people. So I think there is this kind of bind that civil servants, but the United Nations itself somewhere is caught in, promotes. What I have seen is that there are extremely dedicated United Nations civil servants, and in particularly those that staffed and built the first office of the Secretary's Representative for Children in Armed Conflict, the first Secretary's Representative for Sexual Violence and Armed Conflict, and the Human Rights Office has had excellent people that have been there. But we all know that the main power engine at the United Nations are states. They're in discussion with civil society, but states vote at the United Nations through the General Assembly or through the lopsided procedures of the Security Council. The interlocutory who's gained the most power at the United Nations has been civil society over the past 25 years. So all of you who are engaged in civil society organizations or NGOs, you are gaining power at the United Nations if you use it. If you don't use it, the state walks in and state coalitions become very powerful.
Thank you, Patty. Now, you teach at Oxford University. You teach international criminal law and human rights law. What are the pressing issues facing the next generation of legal scholars and practitioners in these fields?
Let me say first, when I came in today, I didn't know what to expect, what group would be here. I'm happy you're not all wearing gray suits, and high heels with 2 or 3 inches. Really didn't know, peeked in and saw. And that made me joyful. But the other thing that made me joyful being a professor from Oxford is seeing Sultana there and Colleen, 2 of my former dissertation students. What is cutting edge at Oxford, and particularly in the Masters of Human Rights Law program, is producing people like you who are going back out into the world and questioning the structures and rebuilding the structures and destructuring and constructing at the same time. Oxford, in some ways, I think, has been a place where we have tried to ask some human rights activists in their multiple manifestations, come in and get a little bit of shelter, come in and learn a little bit of theory, come in and meet an international contingency or cohort that's not competitive with you, but that is with you and will become your networks. This is really what's cutting edge about Oxford, that one realizes after they leave. While they're in Oxford, the cutting edge is that I think we as professors try and bring, and particularly, I think under humanitarian law, under environmental law, under international criminal law, some of the worst case scenarios and ask you to use your brain. What would you do if you were the judge in this case? What should have been submitted in this case as an argument, and why was this argument faulty? To see that light go off in the classroom in someone's eyes, like, oh my God, I just got it. I just got it. I had a student this summer who came up to me and said, so do you mean to tell me under the statute that unless the genocide is committed, public and direct incitement to commit genocide can't be charged? I said, yes, you just understood. We've taken a step backward from the Rwanda tribunal. Those are my golden nugget moments, because I know that a fire has been lit and that this Ukrainian woman is now going to question that, and eventually that's going to be changed. So I consider that to be the cutting edge at Oxford.
Amazing, thank you. So what advice would you give to young professionals, many of whom are here who are aspiring to make a meaningful, well, let me rephrase that. What advice would you give to aspiring lawyers who want to make a meaningful impact in the field of international criminal law or human rights law?
Well, I think I've already been lecturing to you enough, but you have to understand it's because I'm taking the advice I'm about to give you. I bring myself to the issue and to the question. I come from an African-American background where for a certain amount of time, you could have two professions. You could either teach or you could preach. And I've decided to become a lawyer and combine them both. So my first thing to tell you is to bring you, really bring you. Don't come as an imitation of who you think the lawyer should be. Don't come and leave some of your humanity at home because you can only take, the most upright profile of yourself. In order to bring you, you need to get to know you. And you need to make the horrible assumption that you're a human being too. So while you're going out fighting for human rights, you can't deny your own humanity and seeing yourself as a human being. If not, it does become missionary work. And you eventually start othering the other. You're saving them while drowning with yourself. So my advice is to know yourself, to respect yourself as a human being, and then to form community. And then to forgive yourself when you make a mistake, praise yourself when you do well, extend praise to those next to you, forgive those next to you, and keep building community. Because the more we build and understand who we are humanly, the stronger our advocacy of human rights can be. I have met, I think, women in this field who have tried to imitate men and tried to make sure that, they never talked about anything that had to do with gender. They would always want to be at the boys' club when they were discussing. Their legal skills were never looked upon by the men they were trying to imitate as high as the legal skills eventually of the persons who were there to really bring themselves as they were into the legal field. Do not imitate and do not become an imitation. But a human rights lawyer has to have some plants. I would get some puppy dogs and some cats. I would try and have some partners. I would make sure I would keep in touch with family or create family. I would learn how to at least dance 1 or 2 steps, line dancing, better in a group. I would sing privately or publicly. I would learn at least 3 good jokes that you can pull out at any time. And I think that I think as our last speaker said, remember to be grateful. Just once or twice a day. And take a break and then get back to work. And when you're at work, be at work. That would be my advice.
I've already taken your advice. I have 2 cats.
Good.
You've received lots of prestigious awards and honors for your contributions to international law. What are the achievements you're most proud of, and what do you hope your legacy will be?
Well, I think the awards that I've received that I'm most proud of are the ones that come from my hometown. And I come from a town called Camden, New Jersey. So every time I come to London and I see Camden Town, I can't believe it, you know? But that's Lord Camden, that's colonization. And I live on a street called Ormond Avenue, and I think there's an Ormond.
Great Ormond Street, yes.
I walk by it, I can't believe it. This is colonization. Well, anyway, there are 2 women's groups from Camden, which is a town right across the bridge from Philadelphia, 100,000 people. These 2 women's groups, one is a group of African-American teachers, and they teach basically high school to elementary school, not university professors. And they gave me an award, I think way back in the early 2000s at one of their breakfast meetings. Now, they had no idea really what international law is about, no idea really what I was doing there and what was Yugoslavia. But the love and the blessing that they showed me to say, you're out there for us. Even today, I tear. That award was excellent. And then the second award was about 10 years later. There was another women's club, again from the greater Camden area, called Women 2001. And what this women's club did was to fight against the stereotypes of Camden as a ghetto, and to fight against the stereotypes in 2 directions. One was for the politicians to stop ghettoizing, underserving us. And one was for the children and the young people in that town, for us not to take on that mentality. So when I won their award and came back to explain what I do, and that's where we danced communally on the line dance, that just gave me the energy to return to genocide and crimes against humanity and war crimes. And they're the ones I'm the most proud of.
Thank you. Now, lastly, I would love to speak to you for hours and hours, and I think it's just absolutely fascinating listening to everything you have to say. But I have to, I guess, wrap up at some point. This is my last questions, but we'll just take a very quick few questions from the floor after I finish this one. So what are your hopes for the future of international justice and human rights? And how do you envision your continued involvement in advancing these causes?
Right. Well, my involvement, I think among the projects that I will be dedicated to for the next couple of years is making sure that the slave trade is a provision for the slave trade is in the new crimes against humanity, because I see its absence as a form of colonization, a form of ignoring the experience that happened not only in the transatlantic slave trade, but in the East African slave trade, but also in the enslaved people that went out of India into Malaysia. And the indigenous population of the Americas were enslaved also. So I think the slave trade not only should be a provision, it is already within our treaty law, our customary law, the fact that it has been ignored at the international level and sometimes substituted for trafficking, which comes from a different source. I see that as something that I am passionate about rectifying, and I will not stop being involved in international criminal law until that is undone. So already the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, Sierra Leone is moving to amend it, and I'm engaged with Soretta and others for the draft crimes against humanity. And that's where I want to leave you, but focus you. This is the first time that there will ever be a treaty on crimes against humanity. Up until now, it's always been under customary law, but never codified. And so I approach it from this point of view. Crimes against humanity, of course, are for us, for human beings, for our humanity. And if women and girls are not involved in this process, what will happen is 25 years from now, we'll say, oops, why wasn't that included? Oh, how can they still be treating us in that way? I think, and the legacy I would like to leave is that that Crimes Against Humanity treaty is so tough, is so firm, that there is no discrimination that is allowed to continue, in particularly against girls and women. I would want that treaty to be spoken about as one clasps their hand and says, oh my God, the genocide treaty, we can't change it, we can't do anything. That's what that Crimes Against Humanity treaty should be for us. So if you would do me a favor, is just that go on a website and look up new proposed Crimes Against Humanity treaty, look at the draft articles. You don't have to do anything else other than that. I just want you to absorb that on one or two cellular levels. If you want to get involved further and further, then you can do that. But in your mind, please pledge to me that you will at least look at that draft Crimes Against Humanity treaty if you claim to be part of humanity.
Thank you so. Thank you so much, Patty. Can we just take one or two questions from the floor, or we can, yeah, we have a hand up there. Hanifa?
Yeah. I just want to say a huge thank you for your talk. It's really powerful. I think the thing that I found really interesting was when you talk about new politics and the formation of that new politics, and then at the end you talk about community and civil organizations and really the power you felt from the award that your community gave you. How do you see that community work and that local level and that relationship with the international in this new politics that you're talking about?
Right. Well, the community group that I was talking about, the two different community groups made up of African-American women were not necessarily thought to have political voices, right? And it's a difference of how someone from the outside sees you and how you know who you are. You know, and women are political every day. You know, the decision of what to buy, what not to buy, what to say to a child, and all of these other things. So I see that in that coming from that community, they've helped me create my voice. They've allowed me to know that I know what time management is. Time management is having 3 kids and taking a night course and getting the dinner on the table. I don't have to go to the Harvard MBA to take a course on time management. So I really see this relationship between the local and the international, maybe in threads that other people, you know, can't perceive. I don't think it's haphazardly that I'm the one who suggested the enslavement charge way back in Coonrotz, but I think I was the only African-American in the prosecutor's office. You know, this is part of my culture. So I decided to bring me to work and say, this might be in Yugoslavia. These might look like women and girls who don't look like me, but I think what's happening to them is enslavement.
Thank you so much. I think we'll have to leave it there now. Thank you so much, Patty.
Thank you.
We're incredibly grateful to you for coming to us.